nice snap to it. Today I'm going to show you how to turn a cacao pod into a chocolate bar. Super awesome, super fascinating process, one that you can do at your house. Let's get started. All right, so we need to get the cacao bean out of the pods. You can cut into them lengthwise or right through the middle right here, or you can take like a mallet like this and just crack it, okay? And look at that. Look at those beans right there. Get a close up here, maybe we can see that. That is what the bean looks like, and it's covered in this white flesh. Now that white flesh is edible, and it has a nice sweet, juicy flavor. So we want to ferment these. I'm just gonna grab all these seeds out of here. I have a bowl here already, so I'm gonna just take these and put them in with those. And the reason why we want to do the fermentation is gonna build a lot of flavor into that cacao bean. Let me do this one. Yeah. Close up of those cocoa beans. All right, now that we harvested the beans, it's time for the fermentation phase, and this takes anywhere from 5 to 7 days. So I'm just gonna cover this with a nice clean cloth here. And then I'm just gonna rest the lid on there so it can breathe just a little bit, but you can also just put it in like a mason jar and then screw the lid on there too. And we're gonna let this sit for 5 to 7 days and come back and I'll show you what it looks like after that part. All right, it's been 7 days, time to take a look at these cocoa beans or cacao beans. Look at that, look at how the color changed on the outside. There's a pungent, kind of like a fruity alcohol smell. And look at these. I'm gonna give you a little close up here. That's what those look like when they're fermented. So these are properly fermented. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna just take them and put them on this parchment paper lined sheet pan. I'm gonna spread them out so we can go on to the next phase of chocolate making, which is the roasting of the bean. Preheat the oven to 300 degrees Fahrenheit or 150 Celsius. Into the oven this goes, and we're gonna roast them for about an hour, 1.5 to 2 hours. They'll be very dry as well. And once the cocoa beans or cacao beans are done roasting, they'll look something like this. They'll be really nice and dry. And they may or may not look this dark. The reason why these look so dark, it's that gooey flesh that was around it. That is what got burned-ish, but it wasn't the actual bean that got so discolored. Now I want to peel one of these. The next phase is called the winnowing phase, and that is separating the seed or the bean from the shell. All right, so that is what the little cocoa bean looks like once it's deshelled. See that? So what I need to do now is I need to deshell all of the beans, and then we'll go to that next step, which is the grinding step. I spent the evening watching TV and then cracking the beans and getting the nibs out of them. And it's kind of like a therapeutic process. Here is another bean. You should be able to hear it crack. Hear that crack? And then you should be able to just break it in your hand and then get the nibs out of there. And then the shells are just really dry and you can separate them from the nibs. Pretty easy. Check out this cocoa bean right there. And then again, it should be able to just kind of smash in your finger. Like that. Nice dry, roasted cocoa bean. If you let this dry, like after you ferment it, if you let it dry like in the sun for a couple days, then that fleshy stuff kind of evaporates a little bit and dries all around, and then the seed looks more kind of brownish, and then when you roast it, it doesn't get as dark as it did. I used a total of, I think it was 3 or 4 cocoa pods. I think it was 3 cocoa pods, and I got about 160, 170 grams of cocoa nibs total. Now it's time to make these chocolate bars, and I'm gonna do a milk chocolate and a dark chocolate. And then the dark chocolate is gonna be a 70% dark chocolate. 70 grams of cocoa nibs, and then we're gonna do 25 grams of sugar and 5 grams of cacao butter. You don't have to add extra cacao butter or cocoa butter. It just helps with the consistency, just makes a little bit better chocolate. But again, you can just use cocoa nibs and sugar if you want for dark chocolate. So I wanna measure out 70 grams here. 70 grams of cocoa nibs, perfect. After you do the winnowing phase and you're left with the nibs, we have to do the grinding phase. And this is done a couple different ways. If you are a professional chocolatier, then you're gonna have what is like called a chocolate mélanger or mélanger. And it's pretty much a whetstone grinder is what it is. It's just a metal drum with these stones on the inside, and then they turn and turn and turn, and you let it run for like 24 hours, sometimes a day and a half. And that really gives you a super smooth chocolate. I don't have one of those. If you're gonna make chocolate all the time at home, get one, you'll love it. So I'm just gonna do it in a way that most likely you will be able to do at home. I'm gonna do this in a blender. You could use a food processor, you could use a coffee grinder, or you could use like a mortar and a pestle. And then I have my cacao butter right here, or cocoa butter, and I'm just gonna melt that. Again, that's about 5 grams. I'm gonna melt this. You can do it on the stovetop with a double boiler, or I'm just gonna do this in the microwave until it's nice and melted. And then I'm going to use 25 grams of sugar, and I'm using powdered sugar, or this is just confectioner sugar. I'm not too worried about the cornstarch that is in there because I've done this before and it works just great. But if you want a nice pure powdered sugar, just grind up normal sugar into very fine powder. Traditionally, just normal cane sugar will be used in chocolate, and then when you're putting it in that chocolate mélanger or that conching machine, and as it tumbles, it's gonna break down those granulars or those granules of sugar, and that's what makes it really smooth. So the powdered sugar just helps make it a little bit more smooth with chocolate. So there we go, that's all we need for a nice 70% dark chocolate. And then I'll put my cocoa nibs in there. I'll put my powdered sugar in there. And then I'm gonna just blend this a little bit before I add that cocoa butter, just on the lowest speed. Okay, great, and that's gonna just break down those nibs a little bit more. And it's just awesome when you open up this blender, it just smells so amazing as those nibs are grinding. All right, that's how it looks right now. We'll keep going. And now I'm gonna add that cocoa butter. And you can just buy cocoa butter online. You can also buy already ready to go cocoa nibs if you don't want to get the pod. It's just really fun to make chocolate straight from the pod all the way through the process. So you do have to kind of do this in stages as it keeps breaking down. Now it's even finer. I'm gonna switch over to my food processor. This is just kind of a small amount of chocolate that I'm trying to do. And so it just keeps getting blown around inside my blender. But look at that. This is where a little coffee grinder would come in handy. And remember, this process in like an actual chocolate mélanger or a conching machine takes several hours to do it. And we're trying to do it really quickly using at-home machinery. I'm going to show you the consistency now. Okay, now eventually you're going to be left with a nice chocolate liqueur or paste. And then if you need to, you can add a little bit more cocoa butter to smoothen it out and so it's not so thick. And now we want to pour this into our mold. I'm not going to temper it at this time. And I'm going to tap it, just get any air bubbles out. And then I'm going to go ahead and put this in the freezer for 10-15 minutes, something like that. And now for the milk chocolate, I'm using regular granulated sugar, 70 grams. And I'm going to blend it into a powder along with my powdered milk. And this is 45 grams of milk powder. Now let's grind this into a fine powder. And then I'm just going to transfer most of this back to a bowl here because I want to do the cocoa nibs first for a little while. That's about 70 grams of cocoa nibs. All right, cool. Once I got that grounded down to a nice little powder here, I'm going to switch over to my food processor again. Again, this is kind of a small batch, and so the blender, the high-speed blender, isn't as good as the food processor. And I'm going to add my sugar and milk powder mixture. And now I'm going to melt my 45 grams of cocoa butter and add that as well. Pour that in there. And now we just got to keep mixing for quite a while. All right, this is looking amazing. Right there, so it is ready to be tempered or molded. I am going to temper this milk chocolate. Okay. So I'm going to take my chocolate and put it in this bowl. So here we go, we got it in a bowl. I can already tell that it's grainy, but that is to be expected because I don't have that chocolate machine. So over to the stovetop, let's go. I'm using what is the double boiler method, or bain-marie, and it's just a pot with about 1 inch of water in there. And then I'm taking my bowl and put it up here, and just make sure that that bottom of the bowl is not touching the water. And then I have the heat set to medium heat, and as the water heats up, the steam is going to warm the bowl and gently warm the chocolate. And we want to bring this up to 115 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 46 Celsius. Constantly stir during this process. All right, let's give this a check. All right, we are there. Now we remove it from the heat, and then we're just going to keep stirring until we can get that temperature back down to 80 degrees. Another thing you can do to help it along is just take some ice, a little bowl of ice here. And you'll also notice that it starts to get a little shiny, the chocolate. All right, there we go. And now we go back over to the heat. And we're just going to reheat this to 86 Fahrenheit, which is 30 degrees Celsius. And then when we brought it down to 80, that is 26 Celsius. All right, there we go. And now our homemade chocolate, milk chocolate, is tempered. Now that the chocolate is tempered, we can put it in the molds. Got 2 nice big chocolate bars out of this. And now since these are tempered, they will just harden at room temperature, but I'm going to throw them in the refrigerator so they firm up a lot quicker because I am impatient. It's been a long process. The moment of truth is finally here after all that work. Time to dive into these chocolate bars. I'm going to start with the dark chocolate here and just remove one of these from its mold. Look at this. Nice bar of dark chocolate. And now let's do the little snap test. Nice snap to it. You can already see the grain in there a little bit. And now I'm going to do the taste. Such a nice, rich cacao flavor with a little bit of fruitiness to it. Really, really yummy. There is a grain to it. Again, the only way to get a super, extremely smooth, store-bought quality chocolate is by throwing that mixture into the chocolate machine called the Melanger conching machine, or just simply a whetstone grinder made for food. But really, really good. All right, now let's do the milk chocolate bar here. Look at that chocolate bar. The snaps really well. You can see the grains on there, to be expected. Give it a taste. Mmm. Mmm. It's such a good milk chocolate flavor. It doesn't melt smooth in your mouth, again because of the way that this was made. But it's such a good flavor. It is so cool taking a cocoa pod and turning it into chocolate bars. The dark chocolate right here, the milk chocolate right there. Pretty awesome. If you want to make homemade chocolate without using cocoa nibs and using cocoa powder, check out my other videos here. I have one for milk chocolate and also one for just normal dark chocolate. There you go. Fun way to make homemade chocolate from cocoa pod to chocolate bar. Take care. Time for me to dive into this some more. Oh yeah.